Coming up, freelance journalist Ali Eteraz talks about growing up in Pakistan and the American Bible Belt. The event was hosted by the Council for the Advancement of Muslim Professionals in Philadelphia. This is just over an hour.
We had a lectern, but I preferred to sit, so this is what ended up being. I wanted to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Imran Iba and CAMP, Council of American Muslim Professionals, the Philadelphia chapter, and also the Brandywine Workshop. They are a fine arts institution in South Philly, and South Philly is a nice place for arts. Boys to Men actually went to school just down the road. So if you're not familiar with the book, we can probably talk about it a little bit afterwards. I'm just going to go ahead and start reading the parts. I'm going to read two different parts. One is situated in Pakistan, and it discusses a madrassa, and the other is in the U.S. and kind of discusses family life. As Pops began looking for a place to send me to school, people wondered why I wasn't becoming Hafiz-e-Quran, someone who memorized the holy book of Islam. It's the highest form of learning, my grandmother declared. First you memorize the Quran, said my uncle, whose two sons, Tariq and Muaz, were enrolled in the madrasa. Then comes everything else. Being a Hafiz was considered the apex of human knowledge because of the revered status of the Quran, a status reflected in the names we gave it, the Lawhul Mahfuz, or preserved tablet, and the uncreated word of God. The Quran existed jointly with God, timeless, immutable, perfect. The Quran was all Allah, though not all of Allah was the Quran. God had poured it through the mouth of Muhammad, and as it existed now on paper was how God intended for the Quran to look, taste, and sound. The act of repeating the Arabic words as they passed through the mouth, throat, and echoed in the chest was a form of transubstantiation, a way of making what was divine enter the human body. Christians took a piece of bread and a touch of wine, and they thought they had taken the body of their God. Muslims passed God in textual form in and out of their larynxes. I was awakened at dawn the next morning. You're going with your cousins to the madrasa, Dadima said. Then she ordered the other women away from her kerosene stove and made me a butter-fried egg with a flatbread we call paratha. The madrasa that Tariq and Muaz attended was on the bazaar side of town. Ammi was nervous about letting me go alone, but everyone assured her, and so she relented. When I'd finished breakfast, she plopped a topi on my head and handed me a frayed little blue lesson notebook containing Arabic. I walked up the alley with the boys, eager to see my new school. As we entered a square, we came upon a donkey tied to a big nail that was driven in the ground. Tariq threw a rock at the donkey, and the animal's grizzled gray felt quivered. Go pull its tail, he instructed me. Why, I asked. When the devil pulls its tail, it brays. I am not the devil, I replied. Tariq shrugged, and we kept walking. We soon passed the donkey cart. Tipping it over, we tried using it as a slide, with only limited success. As we continued our walk, we passed a pair of dolorous cows and tried to stick hay into their big nostrils, but we were chased away by a couple of barefoot girls with gooey hands and feet who had been piling cow dung into buckets. Muaz told them that they were ugly hags with backward feet, and they told him that his head was squelched in his father's anal sphincter. Rather than taking the most direct route to the madrasa, we ducked in and out of people's houses, asking if this boy and that was awake. Then we abandoned the streets altogether. We entered a cement house, and without asking its owners, who sat on the floor of the courtyard eating breakfast, climbed the stairs to the roof and hopped all the way to the end of the block. When we descended the stairs in another house, we chased a few hens around the veranda and discussed stealing an egg so that we could raise our own little chicken. Eventually, we came upon a large paved road. Here there were a few rickshaws and numerous horse-drawn tangas, along with fruit and vegetable vendors on donkey carts, as well as boys urging goats and bullocks towards the canals. We crossed the street and entered a part of town even less developed than ours. Not only were the dusty alleys unpaved and run down, but sewage from the nalis spilled out into the street, creating wide black pools infested with mosquitoes. In the pools of sludge, some good Samaritan had laid a row of rocks upon which pedestrians could step. However, they were laid down for adult-length footsteps, so we youngsters had to hop from one to the next with both feet. As we went forward, there were more emaciated cows, more donkeys, and even a big bull with lowered horns. Eventually, we made it to the madrasa. The madrasa was packed with boys and filled with the drone of Quranic recitation. All other sounds, the naked boys outside, the whirring fans, or running taps, were subsumed under the recitation. At the front of the hall, there was a long wooden bench. 5 qaris with beards, turbans, and sticks sat on one side, and an assembly line of students passed before them. Each student held a little sipara in his hand, or a notebook like mine. When he got to the bench, he flattened it out and began rocking back and forth as he pronounced the words. Once a boy finished his lesson, the Qari either dismissed him with a wave of his hand, or if the boy had flubbed the reading, hit him on the hand with a fat stick. The boys that were hit took the punishment stoically for the most part, though when they'd gone some distance away, they let their faces contort in pain, and they pressed their hands into their armpits and cried. There was a reason the boys took the punishment to the hands without wincing. Those who broke down while being hit on their hands were pulled around the bench by their wrists, and as they twisted and turned, they were beaten on their back and stomach. The students not currently involved in the lesson ran around the hall. They played hide and seek behind the columns, enjoyed a game of tag, or threw the mosque's straw skull caps at one another like frisbees. An impromptu game of soccer with 2 cloth topies stuffed with straw skull caps served as the ball, and they broke out as I watched, with 20 or more students on each team. Tariq told me to take out my book and get in line with him and Muaz. When you get to the Qari, just tell him that you're new and he'll tell you what to do, he said. Will he hit me, I asked. They always hit, he answered. I looked at my hands and then towards the fat stick leaning against the wall, and I started shaking. The hall suddenly felt deathly cold. With each step that took me closer to the Qari's, little daggers of chilly fear jolted my body. Suddenly I heard something like a crack of lightning and looked up at the dome, thinking that perhaps it had cracked. Loud wailing and screaming ensued. But I soon realized that one of the Qaris had become fed up with all the playing and was taking the stick to any child that he came upon. His preferred method was to grab a boy from behind by the hair or the collar, and in the act of yanking him, hit him on the back, the thighs, or the calves. If the Qari caught a boy from the front, he almost always smashed the stick against the shins. That was what had caused the unearthly cracking noise. As the Qari rampaged, going from one boy to another, there was a mad, chaotic scramble. I began running as well. One of the boys next to me was plucked by his shirt collar and yanked back. I had no way of checking whether Tariq and Muaz made it or not. I was only concerned with my own escape. I grabbed my shoes as I ran past the shelf, threw them down, and stepped into them while running towards home. I didn't stop until I got there. When I told my parents about the anarchy at the madrassa, they said that they were going to look into private tutoring. Pops thought it would be better if I received religious instruction at home. He arranged that an educated man named Qari Adil would make regular house visits. Since he would be coming to our home and we would pay him a lot, Pops asked him to teach me about Islam beyond just memorizing the Quran. Qari Adil was a dark, squat man with a silver beard tinged with henna. He had a gleaming smile and wore nothing but immaculate white clothes with matching white turban. He was articulate and cheerful, and to my vast relief, he didn't believe in punishment. He was the head of a popular mosque attended by many important men. The first day the Qari Adil came to tutor, the atmosphere in the house was expectant and serious. Ammi made the sitting room spotless, and the house smelled great. Food, parathas and eggs for the Qari, along with a glass of milk, was set forth. A brand new Quran sat on a new wooden holder, and there were Arabic textbooks and 2 copies of Abu Ala Maududi's exegesis. Normally, one didn't study tafsir at a madrassa, but normally a madrassa didn't have teachers like this one. Qari Adil rang the bell on his bike as he arrived, and I went to greet him. It was a gleaming new silver sorab. His comportment was unlike that of any other religious figure I had met. He was graceful, sparkling clean, and he had an obvious sense of fashion. Riding in the sun made him sweat so that droplets fell from his head into his beard. When he arrived, he dabbed the end of his turban against his face and shook his shirt. Even with me, a kid, he had a nervousness that made me like him. When he finally sat down each day, he began by making small talk with me in a gregarious manner. On most days, after I read the Quran with him, we would read Maududi's tafsir, starting from the first surah, the opening, and moving quickly into the dense material of the longest chapter in the Quran, the cow and family of Imran. We talked about Jews a lot, because the story of Moses and his people takes up a large part of the 2 longest chapters. The reference to the cow in the chapter by that name comes from a story involving a special cow that the Jews were asked by God to slaughter, but which they refused to kill on account of its lactic productivity. Qari Adil told me many stories about the Jews, such as the one about Jewish fishermen who were told to stop fishing on Saturday but wouldn't, because on Saturday, to test them, God would fill the lakes with fish, and greedy people, he said, would become tempted to disobey God. He told me of the way the Jewish people compelled Moses to tell God to show himself on Sinai, and then refused to accept Moses' recounting of the event. He told me how the Jews in exile had started to starve, so Moses had God bring huge heaping plates of manno salva, food from paradise. After a period of eating such rich heavenly food, however, the Jews demanded lean legumes and shrubs and vegetables instead. All of these stories of Jewish disobedience and decadence finally reached a climax when Qari Adil announced that the Jews had been turned into apes. In a gleeful narration he described in careful detail a mixture of his own speculation and Maududi's imagination, how the actual transformation of a man into monkey occurred. Allah turning people into monkeys bothered me. If I were turned into a monkey, I'd eat lice and be unable to fly kites or spin tops. Being able to flip myself from branch to branch using just my tail wouldn't make up for the fact that I would be ugly, hairy, and loud. Besides, there was something strange about the punishment. It wasn't like the other divine punishments I'd heard about, floods, storms of sulfur, civilizations flipped upside down. Monkey making seemed to be designed solely for amusement, things I hadn't associated with God. The possibility that God was a naughty boy in heaven like me, who rolled around in the clouds making people into animals, made me very nervous. I came to fear God, but not just that, I became wary of Him. Only a few weeks into our study, it was revealed that Qari Adil was using the lessons as an occasion to flirt with my mother by writing love letters to her. When Ammi told Pops, the house visit stops and Maududi's books were put away. So I'm going to move forward to after we had moved to the United States and we were living in the South, and my parents were very concerned about the kind of education that us kids were receiving, so they started a Quranic study circle. Ultimately, it became clear to Ammi and Pops that although their methods were a little different, they were both driven by a desire to help Muslims gain paradise. So they joined forces and created the QSC, the Quran Study Circle. The main purpose of the QSC was to get together local families that had children and read the Quran in English. Friday evening was chosen as the official night, which my brother and I objected to vehemently because that was when the 2-hour block of TGIF sitcoms, including our favorite show, Boy Meets World, came on ABC. The introductory meeting was held in our living room. Ammi moved all the furniture out and spread white sheets topped with cushions around the periphery. In the middle, there was a small tray of almonds and some cans of sun-kissed orange soda. Apparently, dark colas were disallowed because one of the chemicals in them was presumably not halal. Males and females in a wide span of ages sat on opposite sides from one another. A problem presented itself as soon as the meeting began. We have 20 people, my dad said, but only 8 copies of the Quran. Also, said Auntie Fiza, a doctor at the local hospital who had a number of sons my age, all our translations are different from one another's. This caused a small debate to break out, which was resolved when Ammi said that she would order a standardized translation the next morning, and the QSC would reconvene in 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, 20 copies of the Noble Quran translation arrived from the Saudi embassy, and the Quran Study Circle was recalled. Ammi and Pops were as excited as my brother and I were irritated. As soon as the meeting began, however, the group's theological differences came out in the open. This Quran isn't right, my dad said, flipping through the Noble Quran translation. You can't say that about the Quran, Auntie Fiza retorted. My dad ignored her. What are these brackets, he demanded, pointing to the editorial comments inserted into the translation. These brackets are not part of the Quran. Forget the brackets, Ammi said, pointing to the footnotes. It's a good Quran. Look, they're at the bottom of the page. It even has hadiths that explain the verses. I don't accept that either, my dad said. Hadiths aren't for explaining the Quran. Then what are they for? Auntie Fiza replied. They're nice stories, Pops said. Stories that we can guide to use our actions. But the Quran is above nice stories. It is the word of God. I think that the Ahl Hadith are right, Ammi said, referring to a denomination whose members considered Hadith to be equivalent to the Quran. Using Hadith is fine, even advisable. I won't accept this translation, he declared. The best translation is the one by Abdullah Yusuf Ali, this one here that my son is using. Yusuf Ali was a scholar, he said. More important, he followed a particular school of law, Pops replied, referring to one of the 4 schools of Islamic law. Being true to that mazhab is the most important thing. But the Noble Quran is free, Ammi said loudly. Look, they even come in different colors, red, green, blue, gold. I will use Yusuf Ali, Pops said, his voice ringing with finality. If you use Yusuf Ali, Auntie Fiza said, you'll always be on a different page than the rest of us. So be it. Better lost than lost. May Allah guide the true Muslim. Over the many months the QSC lasted, Pops was never on the same page as the rest of us. He often peeked over my shoulder to see where we were. He did, however, manage to get revenge. There were many instances when the Quran reached a complex passage and we couldn't make sense of the hadith that were cited in the footnotes. At such point, Pops would stand up and say, now let me read to you what a great scholar of Islam, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, has to say on this topic. Then he would read the whole commentary, even if it was 20 pages long. During the study circle, I always kept quiet, except when it was my turn to read a few verses. I never asked questions or offered an opinion. I spent most of the time wishing I could go into the other room and turn on the TV to watch Boy Meets World's Topanga with her plump lips and thick lips. I desperately wanted to see her kiss somebody. Flim shared my sentiment, though we generally kept quiet about it. On Friday nights, when the clock hit 8 p.m., he would poke me on the foot. Right now, Boy Meets World is on, he would say resignedly. Be quiet, Pops would glare, squeezing his hand. Don't you see that you were doing Boy Meets Islam? Through the QSC, I became better acquainted with Salim, the eldest son of a local family. He was my inverse, my antithesis, my doppelganger. He had recently transferred to my high school, but before that, had spent 10 years at a Catholic academy, an experience that had left him deeply scarred. 10 years with a Nasara, he said, using the Quranic term for Christians. I couldn't take it anymore. Couldn't take mass, couldn't take the nuns, bunch of religious rednecks. Even though Salim had gotten a 1560 out of 1600 on the SAT, and a 35 out of 36 on the ACT, and a 4.0 GPA, and a guaranteed admission to the Ivy League, all honors that I didn't have, he said he wasn't cut out to study all that secular garbage. He wanted to go to the Islamic University of Medina in Saudi Arabia, where he would study his hero, Ibn Taymiyyah, a 13th century thinker prominent among Salafis. He wanted to learn Arabic and study the Saudi Hadith specialist, Sheikh Al-Albani. He wanted to master Islamic economics, like the California convert, Jamal Zarabozo. He hoped one day to run a correspondence course about Islamic theology, like the Jamaican convert Abu Amina Bilal Phillips. And he wanted to travel the world debating Christians and showing the doctrine of the Trinity to be utter foolishness, like the South African Ahmad Didat. His willingness to give up Princeton for the sake of studying Islam made me wonder if my own desire to go into a top college where I would study secular subjects was unworthy and un-Islamic. In fact, I was doubly antagonized by Salim, first for his being better than me in secular things, and then for his rejection of them. Whenever the QSC descended into discussion, Salim participated eagerly, and he always brought the conversation back to Christianity. He learned a lot during his days with the nuns. Did you know, he offered one day, that there were like 300 different gospel variations set out on a table during the Council of Nicaea? Then everyone fell asleep, and when they woke up, there were only 4 left? If that doesn't prove tampering with the Bible, I don't know what does. This is why mankind needed the Quran. Christianity needed a corrective in Islam. My dad appreciated Salim's zealous participation and was irritated by my silence. He often glared at me while Salim was engaged in his diatribes. Initially, Pops made subtle comments to me that were meant to encourage me to participate more actively in the group. When that failed, he told me that I needed to be more confident and more vocal, like Salim. I always wanted to explain to him, though I never did, that my reasons for not participating had nothing to do with a lack of confidence. I simply didn't like it when people spoke for the sake of hearing their own voice, as I thought Salim did. Then one day, several men in the QSC encouraged Salim to lead Isha, the night prayer. It was a great honor when older men, those who were generally expected to lead the prayers themselves, deferred prayer to a youth. This upset my dad very much. He was annoyed that it was in our house that Salim was being appointed imam. They should be picking you because you're the eldest son in the house, he said, but they don't because you don't give them a reason to respect you. In other words, because Salim was louder than I was, he was considered more of a man, even by my own father. So that's a couple of sections from various parts of the book. And I'm going to get Amardeep up here.
We're supposed to move this chair out of the way. There's some seats up front for people who are standing in the back. There's some seats over here as well as over there. So please feel free to come up front. I'll just wait 1 second for people to find a seat. So I wanted to first of all, take a chance just to welcome everybody here. And I really am hoping to hear some questions from all of you very shortly. I did write down a couple of questions just to get us started. I did spend the weekend, some of the weekend at least, reading this wonderful memoir, Children of Dust, and I really enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. And so I just had some thoughts. Some of them are kind of maybe a little particular to myself and my own status as an English professor. But I think Ali and I have a lot in common, and we have there's probably a lot we could say. So let me just start by asking you kind of a broad introductory question to kind of fill in some of the gaps that were between the two passages that you just read from different parts of your life. So, and it's a version of the question that Terry Gross recently asked you on Fresh Air about the multiple names you've chosen for yourself over the years. The 5 names that you have used over the years are also the structuring kind of feature in the book. That there's 5 sections in the book, and each one corresponds to a name. And I'll read the names. Abir ul-Islam, and that section is called The Promised. Amir, the American. Abu Bakr Samak, the fundamentalist. Amir ul-Islam, the postmodern, and Ali Eteraz, the reformer. So it's a very kind of broad introductory question. I'd like you to introduce the basic story of your memoir using these names as guideposts for the stages in your journey. On Terry Gross, your answer was a little abbreviated, but here amongst people who might have had similar experiences to your own, I would invite you to go into detail for the audience, as much detail as you feel like going into.
I think that the question is about memory. And that's something that ultimately is what writing this book boiled down to, is how do you organize what you have done and what you recall and what you remember in your life. And, when I meditated while writing and it kept going back and forth, there were just realizations that there were dominant figures within my own personality that had kind of taken over at various points in my life. And having been a writer, most of my life, and having taken down a lot of this stuff, I just started seeing these people, and they were me. But, I was writing in their voice and with that name, and there were just characters of myself that were just strewn all over the place. And so I found the ones that were the most embodied me at that particular time. But, I want to go back to the question of memory, because when we think about how we retain information, it's usually not what our general sense is, that we just have everything in this long tube and we just kind of reach into it whenever we want. But that's really not how memory works. The way we really organize our life is in various strands, and there are strands that relate to, for example, religion, and strands that relate to people, and strands that are family, and so this is an instance of me kind of reaching into and grabbing that strand relating to religion. So within that, these personalities and these names and pen names were so dominant. Of course, I changed my name from Abir to Amir legally, because that was the immigrant part of this discussion. I was born with a name, and when I came to the U.S., people made fun of it so much, and I just didn't like it, and I wanted a more Americanized name. So I went to the court, and I was in high school, and I changed it. And that discussion where my parents are like, what are you doing? We gave you this name, and it has religious significance and everything. But I said, people make fun of it, so that's it. I'm changing it. And then of course, Ali Eteraz kind of came about because it was this stage in my life where I was so idealistic, and even though I'm older, I was in my 20s when I kind of adopted it, I was so idealistic, I felt like, Islam was getting this horrible name in this post 9/11 world, and something had to be done, and it would always pain me. I felt like kind of emotional pain from all the violence that was occurring in the name of God, and so that was kind of a symbolic gesture that I did. So that's kind of how the book got organized. Okay.
And just a question, kind of a small question along those lines. Is Ali Eteraz your real name?
No, I didn't. I considered changing it officially, but as a pen name, it's going to stick, because ultimately it's also, now it represents a reconciliation, Mm-hmm. It represents a moment where I confronted myself and I said, why are you always living all of these things, and so different characteristics about yourself, and so I kind of feel at ease with it now.
Mm-hmm. And could you say a little bit about another name that we haven't talked much about yet, the middle in your NYU years, Abu Bakr Samak?
Abu Bakr Ramak.
Ramak. Oh, sorry, I wrote it down wrong.
So in college, I became convinced, or I found out that I was related to the first Khalifa of Islam, Abu Bakr. And this was a huge thing for me at the moment. I was completely immersed in religious activism with conservative guys mostly, and I shunned women and just shunned secularism, and so this romantic notion that I might be related to the first, the Prophet's best friend, one of the first people to convert to Islam, it just drove me joyous. Ultimately, I found out that we weren't, and I relate how I found that out in the book. But that was kind of what pretty much put an end to that. But kind of it's weird. The guy that I discussed in my passage that I just read, in a way I became him a couple of years later. When I went off to college, and he sort of had a jump on me in going through that phase, and so that Abu Bakr phase was so moving in many ways. I mean, I can't really emphasize that enough, because on one hand, I was very guilt-laden whenever I interacted with women I was very afraid of socializing with people because I thought they would cause me to have sin. And so I created these like long-standing historical narratives in which I could get lost, and that was my socialization. I was in many ways an introvert, and I related to these historical Islamic religious personalities more than I did people around me. And so that's how that came about.
Okay, great. I wanted to ask another kind of question about naming, and it's a little bit elaborate, and I won't read the whole thing, but it comes from where I'm coming from, as speaking to you as a non-Muslim, but as a fellow Punjabi, and as also a fellow South Asian progressive, a blogger, a reformer, and a complicated secularist. Like you, I have had issues at times with the way my faith tradition is, Sikhism is practiced and transmitted, but like you, I've found it difficult to walk away for all kinds of complicated reasons. So as I say, I think we have a lot in common. And one thing I thought that resonated for me in reading the story of these name changes and these different figures that you have held up and that you have gravitated towards at different points in your life is that it's a story that a lot of us South Asians from other religious backgrounds have also experienced. So there's people who are well known in public life today, Bobby Jindal, whose real name is Piyush. Mm-hmm. There's Kal Penn, whose real name is Kalpen Modi. There's the Jay Sean, the new R&B sensation, whose real name is Kamaljit Singh Juti. There's in the novel The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, there's a character named Gogol Ganguly who has a whole complicated name kind of change sequence where he starts off as Gogol, which was his father's idiosyncratic name for him, which is a Russian novelist, not a Bengali name, and then he changes it to Nikhil to become more Indian when he gets to college, just as you changed your name when you got to college in a way. And then I guess I wanted to ask you, do you think that this is part of that story? I mean, obviously some of the names, Ali Eteraz is very much within the discourse of Islamic reform, and it's very specific to Islam. But do you think it's part of that broader story about finding your identity in American life? I mean, I guess now that I'm saying this, another figure that comes to mind is Malcolm X. Right? Here's a guy who had 3 phases of his life and 3 distinct names for those phases of his life. Maybe he had more than those names, 3 names. But another great American story in a certain way of finding identity. Do you feel that your story resonates with those stories?
Well, Barack Hussein Obama, who used to be
Barack Hussein Obama.
That just came to me.
Yeah.
Right. It's weird because, of course, so much of our socialization within Islam, especially after we came from Pakistan, was due to being immigrants, kind of adrift. Mm-hmm. We were moving all over the place. We didn't really have community. Mm-hmm. We were nowhere near relatives. I was living in the South and the Southwest and places which are not really, centers for Pakistani communities or even in, Indian communities. And Islam was kind of this thing that permeated the whole space, and it was everywhere. And in that sense, being an immigrant and being a Muslim went hand in hand very easily. And so, being a Punjabi didn't really mean anything. And being a Pakistani didn't mean very much. I mean, I can almost think back to the fact that the last time I heard like a Pakistani song was in Pakistan when I was 11, and then when I went back to Pakistan when I was, 20. And it was this weird phase, but still at the same time, we were so... we were kept together by Islam. And that is something that people ask me, when you're talking about the South, like, why didn't you write about, like, the rednecks or the Hicks or the Confederate flags and everything? And I said, because my family was kept together by Islam. And that was our central thing. That was our fuse, and that what kept us in one place. And of course, I think your question is valid. It's just that, for me, there's an extra layer that the immigrant experience does breed. Not just immigrant, I think the minority experience in many ways does breed one to have to question who they are and redefine themselves constantly. But and the extra layer got added for me just because of my circumstances and the kind of environments that I was in, and they were very religious.
Okay. I mean, along the lines of the South and your experience there, I wanted to know what your thoughts are about the word fundamentalist. Because the table of contents of your book describes, at one point, it describes you as a fundamentalist at one point in your life. It also describes your parents in a way as fundamentalists. First of all, I mean, one thought I have is, did being in the Bible Belt help encourage that in an odd way as a rebellion against, say, conservative or fundamentalist Christianity? The second is, you don't really use the word very often in the narrative itself. So one question I wanted to ask you is, do you think that you would ever have described yourself as going through a phase of fundamentalism? Or for that matter, do you just simply reject the term? I mean, how important is the term in your book and you're thinking about kind of these different struggles within for different kinds of Islam?
That's a point of contention between my dad and I, because he doesn't like that term being applied to him, even if he's saying something very conservative. I think what's happened with the word fundamentalism is that there's been a conflation between violent extremists who are labeled fundamentalists and people who just take religion really seriously who are fundamentalists. And I kind of ascribe to that latter definition. I don't condone using the word fundamentalist for violent fanatics or anything like that. And I think the South did help me see that, because you have people who are Christians who are proudly fundamentalist, and they take it as proudly as like a fundamentalist Muslim would, a Puritan Muslim takes that term. And but what is there? They're not engaged in violence. They're not engaged in acts of aggression, right? Sure, they might say, well, everyone but us is going to the hellfire, or you will never be saved, or something along those lines. But that's just their own personal opinion, right? And so having hard theological personal opinions, I call fundamentalism, but I also don't want to vilify it. I think that is an American thing. It's a kind of a human nature approach to living, and you can have verbal confrontations and judge one another without it becoming a sort of aggressive, violent thing. And in the United States, I think, amongst Muslims, we have a very big contingent of very serious conservative, social conservative believers who are fundamentalists. They want to ascribe to the pure text as best as they can, and that's okay. And actually, Philly is a good place for that, because you have women who take their reading so much that they cover even the face, and it's a great place to see it manifested. But at the same time, these are not people who are trying to overthrow the system. They're not people who are engaged in acts of violence. They're just everyday people, and so I think the word fundamentalism needs a lot more discussion.
It sounds like you're drawing a distinction between fundamentalist and extremist, perhaps?
Possibly,
something like that?
Yeah.
So, okay, there's one more question, I guess. Actually, two more questions, then I'll turn it over to the audience. One is a little bit academic, and I hope the audience doesn't mind that. But in your book, you talk about this word postmodern at one point, and it's the fourth phase that you went through. You were the president of your local college MSA, and I was happy to see that there's another one of your MSA presidents from Emory's around here somewhere. You led the Friday prayers at times in your life. You projected publicly the image of a righteous Muslim brother opposed to all the right things. Meanwhile, in private, you were having kind of a very complicated personal life. I won't get into it. People can read the book and read about that. But it definitely conflicted, perhaps, with the public image that you were projecting. And I got the distinct sense that your personal relationship to religion was very troubled at that time. One might even say schizophrenic. The key word you used in describing this was postmodernist. I wonder if you think that, first of all, that is schizophrenic is a good word for that era. And second, how broad do you think that is? It struck me as actually it resonated for me with a lot of people who are very religious in public, and then you find out something about them that isn't really exactly what they seem to be. Right. So I wonder if you think that that's an apt word to describe a lot of this kind of public display of religion that we see in contemporary life, especially in the mass media, both here in the U.S. and maybe even in South Asia as well.
Right. So at that point in college, when I'm leading a community, I had made being or appearing extremely pious into kind of a science. I had like my wardrobe, and I had.
It's very funny the way you describe that.
Yeah, right. And because it was systemized, like you could act a particular way and get away with it, but it wasn't the getting away that was really the issue. The issue was that I didn't have the courage to actually just say who I was, right? And in that sense, postmodernism, which was, I was studying philosophy, I was studying all these thinkers, it's not schizophrenic. What it does, I think, postmodernism as a philosophy is, it says to you that you are a creature that is composed of many different elements, and they might be contradictory to one another, but you can finagle them, you can mess with them however you like. So postmodernism is a sort of positive schizophrenia. It encourages you to be as wild and as inconsistent as you want. And so I kind of embraced that inconsistency, because it allowed me to get away with that, being a religious leader at the same time, going out. And and it was convenient. So I think that's probably why that philosophical system like appealed to me so much. But incidentally, like I discussed, a lot of Muslims I would meet, they were very wary of this term. Like, when I was studying philosophy, a lot of people would always tell me, you're a Muslim kid, make sure you don't study postmodernism. And so it became like people were kind of aware, religious teachers were kind of aware that, there was something in there that would lead to this kind of manipulation. And of course, I did it. So.
Okay. So one more question, I guess, for now, and I think we might come back to there's one we'll come back to after hearing some audience questions. And this is one of the things that really stood out for me in your memoir is the internet, the role the internet's played in your life. You have a passage at one point towards the end of the memoir where you write, quote, "The internet made it apparent that no one was in charge of Islam. It created a free-for-all. Among other things," close quote, and this is me again, "among other things one sees in your book, you've been a creature of the internet from your teenage years when you used AOL in your bedroom. I won't get into more of that. I wonder if you could expand a little on how the internet is changing Islam today. Finally, now that you've erased your blog, which is really how I came to know you and kind of follow your line of thinking, could you describe the role the internet plays for you currently?"
Yeah, I mean, we're the social media generation. We're the generation that had Steve Case, come on AOL and distribute it all over the place, and all these chat rooms were created, and that's how we started getting to know one another and started creating these communities that we still retain. I'm still friends with some of the people that I met, as a teenager on the internet, and it evolved, obviously, after 9/11 to a considerable degree. And where I was involved with was, the blogosphere, what is now sometimes a Twitter, generation, or just social media. And what it has done for Islam is that all the texts and all the history and all the facts are now, available. And all it takes is curiosity to go in there and acquire some knowledge. And once people have that knowledge, then you can just bounce off, you can spout off whatever you want, because you're armed in many ways. You're armed to have a religious discussion. And so on one hand, the internet has definitely increased the religious discussion that takes place amongst Muslims, but on the same time, it has created so many more, offshoots. What I think happened in kind of a global sense within the Sunni Muslim world over the 20th century is a kind of a crisis of authority, where the caliphate, was abolished in 1924, and the nation states were coming up, and there was not really one leading Muslim nation state. So, at the same time, you had the scholarly class from within each country, and people didn't really know who to follow anymore. And the internet really fed into that kind of chaos. You can acquire pretty much anything within the Islamic history, on the internet now. And I felt when I was very involved in activism, when I was very involved in the liberal kind of reformist stuff, I felt that was the battlefield in a way. And that's how we kind of described it to one another. And so the erasing of my blog and the erasing of some of those things was my withdrawal from that. The realization that I was engaged in a sort of kind of a religious conflict. And the way to reduce religious conflict wasn't always through having more discussions, but rather through withdrawal and self-reflection. And that's really when this book got going. I just went and deleted it. It just seemed like the natural thing to do. And so now, I'll read the news and stuff, but I don't relate to the Islamic world through the internet as much anymore. It's more about the things that I've done and the people that I've met, and my attempt is just to kind of stick to that.
Okay. So you pulled back from the internet somewhat, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it's been productive since it has led you to be able to write this great memoir. That's great. I'd like to open to the audience at this point and hear your questions. I certainly have many more I could ask. I think I went a little bit overboard, writing down 15 questions. But what I might do is if you could speak. It looks like we have a mic. Is that a mic over there? So I think he will help us out and try and catch you for the TV recording that we're doing right now. Anyone in the audience have a question? And it's fine also if you haven't read the memoir. Probably many of you haven't. It just came out. I think one of the things that I'm curious to hear from people is your own experiences. That is to say, those of you who grew up and had experiences that similar to Ali's or different from his with regards to relationship to religion, Islam, etc. So if you have things that from what we've just been talking about, or from what he read, earlier, that would be great too. So any questions or comments or sharing from the audience? No questions, comments, or sharing from the audience. Oh yeah, we have one here. It's Asim, right?
Yes.
Yes.
My question is mostly about activism and your time speaking with Rabbi Aaron and Sam in your book. Do you feel activism was a phase you had to go through, or do you think it's a phase that's productive for a lot of people to go through as a means to an end, or maybe as an end itself?
What Asim is talking about is the kind of the pro-Palestinian activism in college, and then to some extent the reformist stuff later. I absolutely value activism as an entity, as an act. The problem with me has been that it's always become a front for my own personal angst or something else, and it's become a way to prevent looking at myself and evaluating myself. So I wouldn't ever diminish anyone's activism. I would simply extol kind of a reflection about why it is that you're doing it, because frankly, let's face it, in my case, I was doing it for recognition and for myself, and there's something wrong about that, And look, I did come to realize that I was being, you can put it egotistical or whatever, or self-centered like that through, just spontaneous recognition. Somebody told me these things, and I had these confrontations, and, I try to describe some of them in the book. And so I think that on that level, activism is something that is a little frightening in some ways, because it lets you run away from yourself.
Questions? I could ask another one while you guys think of them. You have to think of them. You have to ask questions. So I have another one while I'm waiting for the audience to oh, you have one here. Okay. All right, I'll wait.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Now that you've talked about your experience, would you feel that it is more effective or more beneficial for an individual to spend their youth studying math, science, literature, and arts and have an overall exposure, and then explore spirituality at a much more mature and ripe age? Or do you think, considering your personal experience, the fundamentalism or the education for spirituality, the pursuit at a very young age, do you feel that gave you a lot of problems later on in life, or did you miss things that you're like, man, I wish I had just done this when I was a kid? How do you see it, like as opposed to East versus West, or the madrassa versus the modern Western education system?
I think that where I was unlucky, and where a number of my immigrant kids my age were unlucky, was that we didn't really have a system to follow as far as religious education goes. We were just consuming whatever came our way. And that theological difference that I described in the halakha, nobody really knew what to do, and so we were just doing everything all at once. I think that as the immigrant communities become more settled in the West and wherever else they're located, what has to happen is a more systemization of it. I think that kids and younger people can handle spirituality at the same time as literature and arts and math and all the other education. It's just it has to be done in a more responsible way. I definitely see that amongst people who are a little older than me and about my age. There is an impetus amongst them to be good educators, to be good religious educators. But that wasn't always there for me, and I definitely think that contributed to just the wild relationship that I was having. I wouldn't trade it now. I don't regret anything about it, but it definitely made me go back and be like, my life could have been radically different in so many places had I kind of had something to follow. But no, that's a good question, because I have never considered it in that sense.
Just to follow up on that, do you think that having that early experience in the madrasa has had a long-term impact on you? Has it? Because you had this whole other part of your life in the U.S., which is so different from that. But do you think that has marked you in some way?
I don't think so, because one of the parts that got cut out of the book by the publisher is the next section of the book where I went to a Catholic school. We moved, and so I had this immediate recognition that the world wasn't composed of just one kind of people, and I'd love to talk about that sometime, but it didn't mark me in a negative sense. I don't feel traumatized or anything along those lines, and I kind of. Maybe I'm a little bit, insensitive, because when people are like, well, I went to the religious schools, and I hear these narratives of abuse and stuff, I get defensive. I'm like, get over it almost, like it's usually just a part of our life which is crappy, and there's very few people that just have the whole sustained, difficult experience, and so maybe it toughened me up in some ways, but I don't have a negative experience of it whatsoever,
Do you have a positive experience in some way? Do you feel that it marked you in a positive way, in any way?
Yeah, it did, because for one thing, I got to see people being very just raw and living in a very austere and strict way, and I think that was actually good, because you got to see people who get discipline and the way that they live discipline. And one of the things about the madrassas in the late 80s and stuff, where at least the ones that I went to, is they weren't political institutions. They weren't factories for creating militants. They were places where people went to engage in religion and withdraw from the world. And so, yes, they had their negative elements, and they had harsh instruction and stuff, but they were places which were, on the whole, they kept you safe from the world at large, in a way. And that's why parents were sending kids there. Mm. And that's still why parents send kids there. So I did feel a sense of positive. So.
Other questions from the audience? Thank you.
I know it may be too soon to ask you this because the book's only been out a month, but do you have some sense of how young Pakistani Americans are receiving it?
I've gotten some feedback from people our age. I mean, I guess we're young, but although I have a lot of gray hair now, and that's scaring me. But
I have more than you. You're way too young to even be talking about that.
But it's been received positively, because I think where the story is not unique is that we all have seen kind of the confusion all around us. We've seen young men who kind of go through these crazy phases of religious obsession and then just dump it. And we've seen we've seen the kind of the chaos in the mosques and stuff that, we don't really know what we're doing, but we have to do it this way. And then everybody has to do it their way. So I've gotten a very positive response from youth. I went up to a purely youth-held function in Massachusetts, and I ended up hanging out in dorms afterwards, and just being a college kid again. And they all really identified with the college phase of the book, because one of the things that is so there is in college you are sort of autonomous, physically, but not in an emotional sense. You're still reliant on your parents. You're financially dependent on other people, and so there's a lot of conflict that's generated, and they really identified with some of that stuff, especially the Pakistani kids.
Have your parents read the book, and if so, what do they think about what you're? Do you still keep in touch with them?
Have my parents? Yes, my parents have. Actually, I'll be honest. Okay, first of all, my mom read the book 3 times, and the opening chapter, I didn't show her anything at all. I said, you have to wait till the publication, but I showed her the opening chapter, which was about her, so she was pretty excited. And now she's written me a ton of emails just evaluating the book. And she's fact-checking it and all this other stuff. And she knows that actually she was one of my primary fact-checkers, when I was going back. And I was do I have this person's name correct? And do I have the story correct? So on many levels, she was involved in the due diligence of the book. But now, she's she almost thinks that I'm going to produce a sequel and just keep going all the time. And so she's always telling me stuff about her life as if I should be writing it down. And I'm Mom, it's over. That's it. That's all you get. So my dad, I don't think my dad's read it. I honestly, genuinely believe my dad has not read the book, because my brother was talking to him the other day, and he started grilling him, and he was who's it dedicated to? And it's dedicated to my parents. And my dad evaded the question. And so I think that he's seen the videos, and he's seen the press, but he hasn't read it. And which makes sense, because he won't read anything but Urdu newspapers on the internet, and that's about it. So he's very well read, but just very well informed, but he doesn't like to read, and I don't even know if he'll read this book. But I keep in touch with him, absolutely. Going there for Thanksgiving, just hang out with my mom. So my brother hasn't read it. He had his wife read it to him, essentially, and see if he was in any parts, and that's the extent of his interest. So.
right now you're between New Jersey and the Middle East.
Yeah.
But you grew up in Pakistan and went to school here. Do you feel, when you think of home, do you feel kind of a tug? As I'm a Pakistani American, born and raised here, my parents are from there, and I always had that identity crisis of, am I Pakistani, am I American, am I some kind of a mix of the two? So being someone who grew up in Pakistan for a while at least, how do you feel in that subject?
Well, when we're talking identity crises, so there's more than one. There's my kind, which is a first-generation identity crisis, because I consider myself part of my parents' generation in a way, because I was old enough to remember Pakistan, and when I came here, I was old enough to recognize the difference. And then there is your identity crisis, which is you were born here, but your parents identify with another place, right? So I feel like a Pakistani American, but in the same way as sort of the older crowd does, and that definitely colors a lot of my worldview. But the next identity crisis that's going to be dealt with is the one that you're talking about. And people have already started doing that, and it's not just Pakistanis. There's Iranian Americans that have the same issues, and Arab Americans, and not always Muslims. So it is a very good book I'm reading recently. I'm reading a number of books by people who are second generation identity crisis ridden immigrants, right? And one is called Sons and Other Flammable Objects. It's about an Iranian family, and so it's, that I think is the next kind of inquiry for identity issues. So in a way, when I think about my identity, I almost feel like this should have been done like 30 years ago, and probably was, but it's just that through the sheer accident of the fact that in our current world, Islam and Pakistan are in the news, like I get to tell my story in a more public way. That's really the only difference.
Speaking of identity crises, one thing we haven't talked about today is around when you were in college, you went back to Pakistan, and in the memoir, there's a kind of rather harrowing sequence of events that happens when you went back to your father's village. Mm-hmm. Would you mind talking a little bit about that? I mean, I don't want you to have to give away too much from the story, but there's some really interesting events that occur, and maybe I thought you might want to expand on that, and how it also how it forced a new crisis, as it were, of identity.
Well, I mean, we felt physically threatened, and ultimately ended up calling our uncles in the military and getting us out of there. But where it shaped my identity, that the confrontation with religious-looking people. I had gone back to Pakistan, and like I said, I thought I was related to the caliphs, and I thought I was like a, valuable. Like I wanted to be connected to the Islamic world, and I thought that Pakistan represented that, the pure Islam. And then I got there, and it wasn't like that at all, and it was a shock. So that really broke down that. It gave me a reality check about religion, and I'm fortunate to have gotten that, because who knows like where I would have ended up with all the romanticized religious like historiography that I was reading. It could have been anywhere, and so in that sense it was a positive experience. But I think a lot of talking about your generation's identity crisis again, a lot of second generation kids still do have this the sense that the other world is pure or better or different, and in a good way, and it's not always that way, and it's almost like we have to romanticize something, so we romanticize that the past.
Like our parents, all we hear is all the great things about Pakistan and all the things that are wrong with America. So, I mean, that's kind of all we have.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, again over here.
Kind of following up on the last question I had, but what personal philosophy would you apply to your children or your family in the future?
I almost think that I should just subject them to the same stuff I went through, so they can rebel against it and learn. And I'm joking about that, but I kind of am serious about it too, because the nice things about the religion, beyond the community and the ritual and the relationships that you form, the spirituality, is that you get a vocabulary. You get a mythology and a theology and a history that you can kind of do a lot of stuff with and organize a lot of your thinking around. And so, like Christians that have their own kind of vocabulary, and that's really what you're learning when you convert. You're learning words and stories that can help shape and define you, and then that you yourself can manipulate, and I use the word manipulate positively, that you can shape and form accordingly. I think in many parts of my life I felt that I couldn't do anything to Islam. Islam controlled me, and so I wanted to be an instrument. But it's not like that. I don't think we are instruments ultimately that have no say. Ultimately, we are the ones who are constantly engaged in the shaping, and that's kind of scary, because then the responsibility is entirely on you, and you can't just siphon it off to someone and outsource it to like another leader. So.
There aren't any more. Oh, there's one over here.
I guess I'm sure as like a regular contributor to the to Pakistani, I guess you said news, Dawn, that sort of stuff. Have you followed the sort of identity crisis that Pakistan is going through right now with respect to like the ultra modern like urban centers versus like some northern regions that are completely overwhelmed with or I say it carefully,
right.
but extremists or fundamentalists. And what are your views on it? That question often devolves one into policy and what should America do, and I'm not going to get into that because I don't have an answer, but one of the interesting things that I've sort of learned and been taught by experts or just talking to people is that I think that in Pakistan, religion, specifically Islam, has come to conceal a lot of political and material interests and ethnic pain and inequality, and there are reasons that occurred. There are traced in Pakistan moments where like a political leader in trouble would suddenly like Islamize or suddenly do something that was completely like not part of the religious culture. And I did try to sort of do like a freelance piece on this a while back and just try to look at the various moments. And you have like 1973, after Bangladesh becomes, East Pakistan becomes Bangladesh, you have this sudden Islamization. In 79, when you have a military coup, then there's another period. And I think what's happened now is that the religious violence that is taking place is the realization by all parties that really when we are fighting with each other, we have to use the vocabulary of religion. And beyond that, nobody's really fighting over religion at all. So how do you clarify that? Do religious people come in and say, you're not fighting about religion? I mean, they kind of have a vested interest in promoting the vocabulary. So when I look at Pakistan and the identity crisis, I try not to look at it from the religious perspective. And it's so hard because you have these big words flying around like jihad and fatwa, and so I think that's really the extent of my evaluation of Pakistan.
There's one way back there.
If you find that there's a young person that's drifting more towards radicalism, what books and scholars would you suggest they read? Because I had an interesting experience where my brother just said, like, a friend of mine just converted and he's starting to read more radical things, so can you meet with him? So I met with him, but if you were in my position, what would you recommend they read, and which scholars would you suggest that they learn from?
That's funny, because one of the other things that got cut out of what was this book was this long list of books that I read, right? And it wasn't to show off or anything. It was just that this is the literature out there, and there's something very interesting. But one thing before I get to your question is there's this thing called convert zeal, and for some reason, it's in every religion, but Muslims have it like crazy. Right now, and again, I think part of it is because a lot of the people who are converting are being drawn to Islam for the change of vocabulary as a way to cover their own, whatever issues they have. And so they immediately go to the radical side because they feel like that's the most authentic, voice, because it's the most emphatic. And so that's something that we kind of joke around about with my friends, the convert zeal. And that there's a convert stereotype and then there's an engineer stereotype, right? If you're an engineer, you're more likely to go off the deep end, and if you're a convert. But as far as books, we were talking about the systemization, and so within the United States there are various teachers that
have put out what is it called, a curriculum of teaching, and Omar Abdullah, I think, in Chicago has a group of set of books that you can read. Personally, I think that if you are trying to draw people away from a radical mindset, you have to do it through literature and art, and there is enough devotional literature and art within Islam that you can call upon, and it's not, and I'm not even talking about the people that become sort of pop like Rumi and stuff. You can, there's Bulleh Shah in my book, which I sort of discuss, and I should definitely try to compile something or at some point, but other than that, I feel like the religious teachers are probably the ones that have a systemized set, because it kind of has to go together.
This book might be actually a good book for a person like that to read, because it is very much a struggle of somebody as a young. I mean, a lot of it is Ali is quite young, and he's a teenager, he's in college, and he's going through a lot of that kind of struggle. So
the other thing you can do to a radical is just to send them to a Muslim country, and they'll be so like disabused of their romantic notions that they'll just come back. And no, I'm so serious. Like this happens all the time. Like especially when I'm in the Middle East, like I either meet someone or hear about someone, and they go there and they're treated like second-class citizens or like foreigners, and they suddenly like realize that the world is so much bigger. The Islamic world is so much bigger than their like fantastic notions of it. So I mean, that's what happened to me in some ways, So
hand back there.
Yeah. Islam the world over, there's often a debate about cultural influences of different countries and different regions where Islam is practiced, influencing, how it's practiced there. In Pakistan, for instance, you're Sufi, even Hindu, even Sikh rituals and things like that. How would you characterize sort of American Islam that's sort of come up? How would you characterize it in the broader sort of cultural, different cultural contexts that Islam is practiced elsewhere in the world? America, how do you see that?
That's a good question. Before I get going, just another book that I think is good for the post 9/11 identity crisis issue is Homeboy by Muhammad Naqvi, and I started recently. So Hussein Naqvi? Hussein Murtaza, H.M. Naqvi, right? Yeah, I bought it and I haven't started reading it, but I watched his interview at Asia Society, and that gets into Pakistani identity crises and post 9/11 issues. This is very funny, but I think within American Islam, what we sort of got stunted after 9/11, and that happens every time that there's like a major like Muslim figure person just kind of killing in the name of the religion. There is a stunting period, and the Onion like recently released that article when the Fort Hood shooting took place. Thanks a lot, asshole. Right? Like, we do all this work and then we're kind of starting at zero again. But after 9/11, there was absolutely kind of a stunting of American Muslim culture production, like Pakistani, any sort of immigrant culture production. And the kind that did come to the top was simply stuff that would affirm certain political narratives. And there was no other use for Muslims except being like linchpins of other people's political philosophy, and I really did not want to be myself like a token for somebody else's politics, and some Muslims didn't mind being like that, but now I think we're starting to see people willing to tell their own stories and leave it at that, and not make it a larger political issue. But as far as culturally speaking, as someone who lived in Philly for a while, I hear the dominant Muslim culture, to me, in my mind, was the African American one, and it's interesting because it's simultaneously insular, but at the same time, like it's almost invisible. I mean, it's so involved, and you don't see it. I actually met friends who were African American who had been Muslim at one point and are no longer, and some that were raised Christian and are now Muslim, and I never even knew that. Like it's just this really interesting dynamic. I think that in the United States it's probably less based on ideas and more based on locations. New York is very different than Muslims in Alabama and in Houston. So it's going to be, we were having this discussion beforehand, I think there are various institutions around the country, mosques or groups or fellowships or families, even collectives of families that are producing interesting Islam, American Islam, but it's not being, collated. There's no attempt at, understanding it or studying it. And I think journalism is really one of the ways that all those stories are going to have to be compiled and told.
I think we're about at 8 o'clock. If there are no more further pressing questions at this point, you could probably ask Ali some further questions after we close. And there are books on sale in the back, and they're cheap. They're $15. Normally it costs like $25 or something. And there's some coffee and sweets as well back there. So thanks very much for coming out.
So, I guess.
For more information on the work of Ali Eteraz, visit alieteraz.com.
Coming up next.